Hello and welcome to Composition 2 with me, Mr. Fowler. I hope your Thanksgiving break went well. We did not meet on last Thursday, so today for session number 29 and for session 30 on Thursday of this week, I'll have my work cut out for me. That means that I'm going to have to move relatively quickly, but luckily we're just about on pace for the end of the semester, or at least where I would like to be. So for today, I'm going to record a session with you and post this. Hopefully, you'll be able to see it before the end of the week. And I'm just going to lay out some of the procedures for the final exam. Well, it's not really an exam. I can't call it that. For the final project, which is revision 2. So let's go ahead and get started with that. You'll lose my visual, but then you should see my screen here as I prepare our slideshow. So for today, session number 29, we have a brief preview and review that should take no more than 10 minutes. Specifically, I want to talk about the argument essay, which is our principal focus for this week. We want to try to wrap that up by Friday, sometime before 11:59 p.m., approximately midnight. We want to take care of that, make sure that's all in hand. Then we have a little preview today of revision number 2. That might take up to 20 minutes of our overall time. Now remember that revision 2 may be focused either on the argumentative essay, which we're going to complete this week, or you can go back and finish the revision process by taking a second look at your persuasive essay. Also, we have a last weekly discussion question for the semester that you can complete this week. So our focus for today is revision number 2, which will enable us to have one additional essay, so to speak, to revise for the purposes of a final review of the writing process. Again, that could focus on either the argumentative essay, which should be back in your hands by next Tuesday at the latest. I hopefully will get those done during the upcoming weekend so that you don't have to wait even that long. Or again, that other essay, the persuasive project. So let's just discuss this phenomenon of revision in the first place. Why should we revise? Well, first of all, revision is a critical step in the overall writing process. It enables you to focus your time and energy on perfecting the argument in this case, or whatever the writing project might be, in order to smooth out any rough edges and just create a more polished argument overall. Changes in the writing process may be some of the last things that you do when approaching a writing project, but they do focus on some important concerns. Grammar concerns have been our chief focus point this semester. And I generally suggest that there are a couple of specific grammatical issues that you want to have in hand by the time you move on to more difficult compositional coursework. Okay, so anytime you're writing an essay for an advanced class beyond the 100 level, you really should strive to eliminate things like comma splices, where the internal punctuation of a sentence is limited to a single comma. That's a type of a run-on. A standard run-on sentence, of course, has no internal punctuation. So I guess in that regard, comma splices are a little bit better. Now, the other thing that you really should avoid is the creation of a fragment, which means that a basic sentence is lacking a subject, verb, or object. It's lacking some of the constituent elements. In addition to having a subject, verb, and object, a sentence should also make sense. It should state a complete thought. Lastly, commas. Now, commas and comma usage will vary from one instructor to the other. So I try not to overemphasize comma usage to such a degree that students find the rules to be extremely confusing or too numerous to manage. In that regard, I suggest that with commas, you focus on using a coordinating conjunction to join two independent clauses together as a compound sentence. You should also use commas to separate items in a list. I think that's pretty basic. And you should also use commas with introductory, especially introductory prepositional phrases. These kinds of basic things, these three basic rules, I think are where I see the most issue with punctuation errors. Now, there are also a number of other comma usage rules. In fact, there are 3 additional ones, but those tend to be less consistent issues in student writing at the collegiate level. They include using commas with things called appositives, which are phrases that rename or give extra information about a noun. When they follow a noun in the middle of a sentence, you flank the positive information with commas around both sides. When they come at the end of a sentence, you introduce the appositive with a comma. Those are what are referred to as non-restrictive clauses, meaning that they don't change the meaning of a sentence if they're tossed out. But if they're going to be left in, they need to be punctuated correctly. There's also a number of concerns that have to be addressed with commas dealing with dates and years and separating city and state names, things of that nature. But this is all fairly rudimentary grammar that I haven't seen anyone really have an issue with, at least not this semester. But those things are sentence level issues or concerns that do need to be addressed and are usually found or fixed in the revision process. Beyond that, there are certain stylistic concerns that are mentioned. Now, stylistic concerns, there's no such word as stylistical, are really useful in terms of structuring your papers to make sure that your audience understands the relationships between your ideas. So if you're comparing and contrasting things, you need to make sure that you have your specific watchwords and transitional phrases well in hand. You also should make sure that with a style, an eye toward style, that you're using parallel structure, which means that your verbs are of a consistent nature. And we talked about this a little bit last week. So parallel structure would suggest that you would get more out of sentence construction if you're using one consistent verb type, like gerunds, for example. And we read through that other example from your textbook, practical argument. So if you need to review that, it should be in session number 28, PowerPoint. Grammatical concerns, again, with grammar revision, I take care of a lot of that for you, and I've already laid out what my chief concerns are. But clearly, doing something as basic as running a grammar check is recommended. And I even have some students that use the service Grammarly. And I think that that's a good idea. I would not criticize anybody who does that. And in fact, I think it's a wonderful use of, the student dollar, especially as it relates to non-grammatical courses where you will still occasionally run into an instructor or professor who grades on grammar, even if that's not the primary focus of that particular course. Lastly, along the same lines, there are a number of formatting concerns that we should always take into account anytime we are revising. That might be in relationship to format concerns as they relate to MLA or APA style, depending on which format you're going to use going forward. And that means, for example, using technologies like bibme.com or Citation Machine to make sure that your works cited or references page are properly formatted, right? One thing that has come up lately that I will mention that I thought was pretty clear, but has proven to be not so clear, is that remember when you're formatting your works cited or references page, you need to alphabetize that list by the name of the author, the last name of the author, or by the last name of the first author if you have multiple authors. If there is no author name listed, then you would alphabetize the entry by the word, if it's a definition, or by the title of the article if it's from a periodical or peer-reviewed journal. That may also be a factor for websites. Most of the time, websites have sub pages or subsections that can stand in for the article or title name. But again, if that does not occur, then obviously you'd use the web title in lieu of an author name. Additionally, make sure that your formatting for your in-text citations are consistent, which means that you introduce the quotation, you open up the quote, you write it as precisely as possible for your paper, you close the quote, then you have the parenthetical information, meaning exactly the information that comes in between the parentheses. And once that's done, the period finally goes at the end. I've got a couple of people putting periods before the quotes and then leaving these hanging parentheses at the end. And that's confusing sometimes when you're in the midst of using a source and writing a paper for a specific deadline. But again, it's open quote, close quote, parentheses, period at the end. Now, for this next project, the revision or revision number 2, you're going to have to select between the persuasive essay or the argumentative essay. So how do you make that choice? Well, there are a number of factors that might come into play there. The first factor, of course, may be the easiest way to determine which would be the preferred essay to approach. You may have received a B or a C, or perhaps even a lower grade on one of the essays or the other. Now, if you did that, obviously for the revision, you would have a clear candidate to focus on. If you end up doing relatively well on the argument and you did well on the persuasive essay, then you have a little bit of a different path to consider. So if that's the case, I would ask you to consider the following questions. Did you have more to say, or were there additional argumentative points that you could have used to sway the perspective of your reader? Perhaps there is an opportunity to further clarify your position in order to make the best argument viable in the minds of your readers. And again, I would conclude by saying maybe you don't even need to focus that deeply. Maybe you just want to fine tune a paper. Asking yourself about how you can take advantage of the opportunity to refine your assignment may be the best course of action you could take in preparing for this essay. Okay. Now, once you select the essay, you may want to think about how to begin the revision process. I would begin with an overview, asking yourself some questions about the assignment and the audience that you intended to address in that project. First of all, have you read and reread your assignment to understand the guidelines? Rereading a paper or an essay is a really good revision step that I think everybody should try. If you've never done it before, I recommend rereading your essays backwards. That's not to say I want you to reread the words within the sentence backward, or even the sentences from the last sentence to the restatement of your thesis during your conclusion. It's not Bizarro world. But rather, I think if you start with your final paragraph and read that from left to right until the conclusion, you'll get a better sense, or at least a different sense, of how the grammar stacks up and how the logic is working. Because if you can read an essay literally backward and forward and the argument still holds water, you've got a good essay on your hands, or at least there's a sufficient argument to suggest that your point has been well made. For the audience, you may also want to consider whether or not your essay was written appropriately, meaning, does it lay out your argument or your persuasive theory in a way that they might understand and appreciate all of the diligent work that you've done? Now, for a large stake of this class, I have been your principal audience. But if you would like to get a peer-to-peer review, similar to the initial peer review that we did for an ad analysis assignment, just reach out to me, and during finals week, I'll make sure that you have a peer who will give you some peer feedback to make sure that your argumentative paper is stacking up in the way that you expect it to. Then, turning an eye to structure, I would begin by looking at your introduction. Does it create a topic of some sort of interest? Does it pull the reader in some way, shape, or form? Are the 5 W's sufficiently addressed so that your audience has enough background information to understand what's at stake and what's being argued for without being overwhelmed by a massive infusion of information? And do the beginning sentences of your introduction logically lead toward a thorough thesis statement? And let's pause for a second to consider that element specifically. Does your thesis express a distinct claim about the topic? Is it limited to one central idea, and does it justify further discussion or debate? Additionally, a thesis may preview the overall argument structure and the way in which you plan to introduce, or the ways in which you plan to introduce, your evidence as support for your position. Moving on to the body, your body paragraphs should begin with topic sentences which indicate the main controlling idea of that specific paragraph. Remember that the main idea directly relates back to the thesis in some way, shape, or form. Paragraphs may be a place to evaluate substantive evidence and support your analysis by introducing quotations or paraphrasing the ideas of another author or writer who supports your position. Now, no matter how you introduce that information, the thoughts that you process should move from paragraph to paragraph in a way that has a familiar, somewhat organized structure that your audience can follow. Lastly, your conclusion should emphasize or re-emphasize your topic and thesis. In fact, I've often said that the first sentence of a good conclusion is a refurbished or re-explored thesis statement, a version of your thesis, in other words. And then you start from a, again, specific point and move to more general observations as you sum up in the conclusion. Sometimes this may feel like it's too boring or standard, but the other side of a boring or standard essay is that it's usually well understood and well structured. Try to create an essay that doesn't just end abruptly, but actually propels your audience to take some sort of action or at least consider the skill with which you have made your argument clear. When it comes to fine-tuning, make sure that you have read over your essay to check for those grammatical concerns that we mentioned during the introduction, and make sure that you have cited your sources, both in text or parenthetical, and your references or works cited page clearly. And like I said at the beginning of this lecture, there are so many sources that you can use that will help you do just that. Okay, lastly, let's turn to this week's WDQ, or weekly discussion question. So this week, it's pretty easy. I'm just asking, do you feel that you have the adequate time and resources to complete the argumentative essay? If not, I encourage you to write a little bit more about what it is you might need to sufficiently do well with the time remaining. Again, you can answer this question in the discussion forum, and it won't be a big deal. Just try to get early responses in so that there's enough for other students to respond to. And if you need to take some time even into the weekend to get that done, you can still do that. I think that'd be more than fair, given the fact that you have a paper that you're working on actively this week as well. That will be the final weekly discussion question for the semester. So when you're done with that, you are done with that whole portion of the class, and that'll be one additional concern that you can check off of your list. Okay, the rest of today's time or session is really up to you. However, if something else should come up, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Well, that's pretty much it for today. I know it seems like we're running out of quality information and topics to discuss, but at some point you need the time available to complete this assignment, the argument. I've had 3 argumentative essays turned in as of this recording, and they are all done very well. So I don't really see too many problems cropping up for this group. But like I said in the presentation, should something come up, or should you fumble, or just have a question or need clarification about something, email me. I'll be available this week until about 4:30 in the evening. And then, of course, if there's an emergency, email me then. There is one bracket of time this week, tomorrow on Wednesday, where I'm not going to be available. I have an interview vis-a-vis Zoom. So I won't be able to take your questions until 2:30. Usually I take a break during the day from 12:30 to 1:30 for lunch or something like that. But tomorrow, Wednesday, the 2nd, I'm not going to be available during that standard time. What I will do though is I will be available starting at 2:30 in the afternoon. And then I will take your questions up until 5:30 just to make up for that hour discrepancy there. Again, I want to thank you for your time and your dedication to the course. This is Mr. Fowler signing off, but reminding you to think critically, to stay active, and to explore all of those avenues of education that are available. Okay, take care, folks.